It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Professor Paul Fenton. We're here in your beautiful home in Jerusalem. And Paul, you have an incredible, illustrious career as a professor. If you could just tell us a little bit about your family, your background, and how you eventually came to Israel.
Okay, so it's also a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to speak about myself and my biography, and I think that it will be a source of enrichment for people who are delving into the history of Anglo Jewry on the one hand, and because of what I became, that is an Orientalist, my take on what could be the relationship between the Jewish people and their neighbors here in the Middle East, which will be my last message. Okay, so I can start with my great-grandfather, who lived in the city of Plock, which is about 60 miles north of Warsaw, and he had a very large family, and there was an epidemic of cholera that broke out in Plock, and he brought all his family to Posen, which is still in Poland, but which at that time was under Prussian occupation. So the family changed from their Yiddish. There was a German influence, and then when the epidemic subsided, he was undecided as to where he wanted to go, but Bismarck decided for him and expelled all the non-Germans from Eastern Prussia, as it was known then. It has now been returned to Poland. So at that time, America was on the lips of every Jew who was meditating about leaving Eastern Europe, and he decided that he would make tracks for America. So the first stop was in London, and the family story is that he was told that they had arrived in America, and that the proof was everything was in English. So he must have been very poor geography, and this is where he unloaded his luggage, and the family settled in London. But there might be an ounce of truth in this, because when he'd realized that the mistake that he'd been led into, he then left for America with his two elder sons, and they made their way to Chicago. But my great-grandfather was not very happy about Yiddishkeit. He was a pious and observant Jew, maybe of Hasidic descent. He was not happy about how Yiddishkeit was developing in the New World, as it was called, and he came back to England, where he'd left his wife and the younger children, one of whom was my grandfather. So the family then settled in London. The story is that one of my great uncles had already come to England in the 1850s and had married a Jewish Englishwoman who was actually of German origin, and he had brought her back to Plock, and therefore there was already this link established between Plock and London. Now that's probably why the family also decided to settle in London. They had family there.
And Paul, what was the original name?
Oh, so we had a Polish name, Fajka, which could either mean, it might be a variation of Fajga, which is a metronymic name, a feminine name from Fajga, Fagel, the name of the first name of a woman or girl, or it could be Fajka in Polish means a pipe, and indeed it seems that my great-grandfather was a corn merchant who also dealt in tobacco. So He may have got the name Feike because this is the sign over the shop, or this is what he dealt in. Anyway, during the war, my father served in the British Army, and he was told that the name, a German-sounding name, was not advisable, because if he was taken prisoner, if he was in active service and taken prisoner, he'd be in for it. So this, by the way, is a time of the ex-troops, which was a English military group of German origin. They were German Jews who worked as spies and fifth columnists behind the German lines. So with the German name, they got, if they were ever caught, that was it. That was the end of them. So my father changed his name to Fenton. That's where the name Fenton comes, which is first of all a very English name. And many, many years after my father died, I was wondering where he was inspired to get this name, and it came clear to me that it was quite popular among East London Jews, because there was a Fenton Street in the heart of the East End of London where the Jews lived. So someone who was Finkelstein or Feitlovich, he changed his name to Fenton, and thereby became an Anglo-Jewish, a member of the Anglo-Jewish Society. So that accounts for my name. My parents moved out of the East End, where they were brought up, Yiddish speaking, because my grandparents never learned English or spoke broken English. And we moved to Stamford Hill, which was an up-and-coming Jewish area. And at that time, immediately, I was born in 1951. In the early years after the war, there was a massive intake of survivors. First of all, German Jews who had come before the war, and Polish, East European Jews that came after the war, which transformed Stamford Hill into the hub of Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic, if you like, lifestyle in London. And that is the case till this day. It's probably after Antwerp, it's probably the biggest and most vibrant Hasidic community in Europe today. So I grew up in Stamford Hill, but my parents were sort of on the edge of the community. We went to a federation shul, which was like a shtibel, which belonged to mainstream Anglo Jewry, but was not part of what we call the English Achayas. That means the English the Jewish creatures of England, which were old, long-standing Anglo Jews who had been there for 2 or 3 generations, some of whom came from Holland in the 19th century, and whereas the newly arrived East European Jews had their own Stiebelach. This was very visibly the case in Stamford Hill, where there were multiple Stiebelach. Even in the East End, many of the Stiebelach carried the names of the towns or cities where the Jews came from. For example, there was in Commercial Street in the East End a Plotzker Shul, a synagogue which was established by Jews from Plotsk. So we went to a cheder. In fact, it was very intensive hours. There was cheder 4 times a week. Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, we had to come to the children's service to learn how to daven and how to lein, and Sunday morning. So we had, in fact, more hours of Jewish studies than in many Jewish schools. I didn't go to a Jewish school, and but I was brought up in what we would call now a cheder mutukan. I had a fantastic teacher. I must mention his name because he played a great role in my life. Michael Tombak. He came from Zhytomyr in the Ukraine, and he taught us grammar and Mishnah and Jewish history, and of course Chumash and Rashi. We had a wonderful Jewish education. And so one day, but we were on, as I said, on the margin. I was made to feel that I was not part of the Stamford Hill crowd. Although, when I went to Bnei Akiva in Stamford Hill, and most of my hours of leisure, on Shabbat afternoon, I would go to Stamford Hill to Pirchim, which was a youth group, or Bnei Akiva on Sunday. So we were very much involved in Stamford Hill, but I was very much on the margin until one day my great aunt, whom I did not know, passed away, and my father inherited a picture album that she had, in which figured this portrait of my grandfather, of my great-grandfather, which we did not have. And it was I wouldn't say a shock, it was a revelation to me that the people who I knew and were familiar with in Stamford Hill, who wore beards, long beards and payas, who I had until hitherto considered as being Yene Chevra, the Frummas. My parents called them the Frummas, that there was something else and we were something else. And this picture put everything into place, that no, we were the same, we were from the same stock, and that I was one of them through my ancestry. And I could say that this was a turning point in my life. I became very interested in Chassidut, and from then on I was like a member of the Hasidic community of Stamford Hill. You asked me to show you some pictures. I wasn't able to dig it out, but I have a picture of me with my friends. I have a bekesha and a Hasidic hat, and I was going that way.
Paul, can I just ask, your mother's family?
This is my mother's side. They came from Minsk, Gebirge, the province of Minsk. From my grandfather actually was studied in Bobruisk, which is in the Minsk province, Governat it's called. But he actually came from a small village, an agricultural village called Shchedrin, and he was the Badchan of Shchedrin. This very man is Badchan of Shchedrin, and which means he was a bard, he was a poet, and he and his children would perform at weddings or bar mitzvahs, and they were very popular, and the Shchedrin actually was a community which had been helped by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe at that time, who wanted to settle Jews on the land, and the peasants there, the landsfolk, were like my great-great-grandfather. They were able to work the land thanks to the subventions which were given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who supported the settlement of Jews on the land. And then at the eve of the Russian Revolution, my grandfather, that's his grandson, was to be conscripted into the Russian army, and he decided to flee Russia. He was hid, but the story is that my great-grandmother hid him in the cellar when the military came to take him away, and when they'd gone, he fled to I think to Germany and thence to England. That's when he came to England.
If I can just ask you, with this picture,
yeah,
it's a very unique picture where you have he's holding a sefer and the sefer is open, and you can see it's in Hebrew or Yiddish.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a prayer book, and it's very symbolic. What did he want to show? You could have a picture taken of a man reading a newspaper or holding a dog, but this is, to me, his attachment to Judaism was through literature, Jewish literature, Jewish prayer. So this is a very cherished portrait that I have. So, as I say, I went to yeshiva. Was actually involved in through Chabad. I went to yeshiva in France. The Chabad in London had a yeshiva at that time in France, in Brunois, near Paris. Now I did French at school, so I was happy to come to Brunois. And then my old cheder master, I think that he appreciated my intellectual gifts, and he was not a yeshiva man. He said, you do better if you want to go into the ministry. And at that time, that's what I thought I would like to do as a vocation. I wanted to be a rabbi. He said, don't go to yeshiva, go to Jewish college. This was a rabbinical seminary which served the Jewish community. And somewhere along the line, I'm very grateful to him, because this is also a very important landmark in my life. Jewish College was a seminary in the style of the East European rabbinical seminaries, where in order to enter the rabbinate, you had to have a training in academic studies. You had to have a university background. Many of the graduates from Jewish College and also the rabbinical seminars on the continent then became Rabbiner Doctor, which was, for the Orthodox, was a big joke. And perhaps I'll introduce the joke about when it comes to a shaila, to her in Germany, she's a Polish woman, and she comes with a chicken to the Herr Dr. Rabbiner, and she wants to know if it's kosher or not. So she said, Rebbe. Said, nein, ich bin Herr Dr. Rabbiner. She said, ich brauche nicht der Doktor, der hin ist schon genifte geworden. I don't need a doctor, the chicken is already dead. So I was destined to be a Rabbiner Doctor, and in the curriculum of Jewish College, we were concentrating on Hebrew, but which was studied in an academic light. We had to learn grammar, we had to learn Arabic. Arabic was part of the curriculum, and we had to learn literary criticism of the Talmud, replacing it in its historical context. This is a completely different perspective, but it was a preparation for being not only a rabbi but a preacher, and also I studied Chazanut, so as a cantor in the Jewish community in England. But but in the end, I became so interested in the academic side that I decided that the rabbinate was not for me, although, as you'll see later in my presentation, I did become a sort of rabbi. So I became more interested in the academic side and in the philological input into Hebrew as a language and a culture, and also the Arabic also was of great interest to me, because I had already been exposed to Arabic, and I'm sure, Les, you'll appreciate why. Because as a young philatelist, I would collect stamps, and I was always intrigued by the different scripts, and in particular the Arabic script. And when I was 10 years old, when I entered Jewish College, I was 17. So 17 years before, I learned Arabic with a book, Teach Yourself Arabic, because I was so interested in deciphering the Arabic script, which had a sort of aesthetic appeal to me and a mysterious alphabet. So I knew Arabic, and I took it up seriously, first at Jewish College, and then later, I took a year off before I was supposed to pursue my rabbinical studies. I felt that because I'd missed out on Jewish education in a Jewish school like Yesodei HaTorah, which was a Jewish, very staunch, traditional Jewish school in Stamford Hill, where they spent half the day studying Gemara instead of instead of non-religious studies. Lay studies. I felt that I was very weak in the Talmud, and I understood, and this is a message for my listeners, that anyone who wants to have a genuine grasp of the quintessence of Judaism must study the Talmud. Everything is seen, the Bible, Jewish ethics, religion, liturgy, everything is seen, halakha of course, is seen through the prism of the Talmud. And as long as you do not possess or have an inkling into what is the Talmud, then you cannot be a fully fledged Jew. This was my conception. So I decided that I was not going to pursue my rabbinical studies for the time being, that I'd go to yeshiva and deepen my understanding of the Talmud.
Can I ask you, at Jews College, who was the head of the Jews College at the time?
At the time,
who were your main professors or your main people that had such an impact on you?
Okay, we had wonderful teachers, really top class teachers. The principal of Jews College, Dr. I'm sorry, his name doesn't come back to me. This is over 60 years ago. He was of German origin. He wrote a historical study of the relationship between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, and he was a rabbi doctor, and all the staff were rabbi doctors, from our Bible teacher down to the Talmud teacher. They were all rabbi doctors, and they had this open-mindedness towards the world of academic learning. So we had a model. This was our model. So coming back to, I went to yeshiva, and I thought that as I'd learned French at A level, in the English education system, after the initial general certificate called O level at that time, you then specialized in 3 or 4 subjects at an advanced level, A level. I did Hebrew and French at A level, and biblical knowledge. You could also do biblical knowledge. I was contemplating doing Arabic, but my Arabic was not up to scratch at that time. I must mention my teacher of Arabic was a man called Emil Marmerstein, who was a very colorful character. Many a time I was invited to his home for Shabbat, and he'd wear a tarbush. Wow. Because he'd been the headmaster of the Anglo-Jewish school in Baghdad. So he was an extraordinary Arabist, so much so that he worked for the BBC. But at the same time, he was, because of his Hungarian connections, he had spent some time with the Neturei Karta in Jerusalem, and he became an anti-Zionist. So his point of honor was that while he was in charge of the BBC Arabic service, never ever did they mention the word Israel. and he introduced the expression El-Kiyan As-Sahayuni, a Zionist entity. Whenever there was news about Israel, it was called the Zionist entity. That was that was his doing. And the story is that my mother was, when I told my mother, I don't want to be a lawyer, I don't want to be a dentist like my elder brother, not even a doctor, I want to be an Arabist. She was very perplexed, and she decided adamantly that she would come and see my Arabic teacher and be informed. So we came to tea one day to Dr. Marmerstein's house in Golders Green, and my mother asked him blankly, well, what can my son do with Arabic? And he said, well, of course it's a very narrow field that is really reserved for academics. However, in the Zionist entity, he will have more opportunity. So my mother said to him, Where? So, but I always have a very soft spot for him in my heart. He was my first Arabic teacher, and as I say, a very colorful figure. And so I went to yeshiva in Brunois because I wanted to combine my knowledge of French with Talmudical studies. And that was also a turning in my life because I became very friendly with the Bachurim, many of whom came from Strasbourg, which, despite a misnomer on the part of some, is not in Germany. It's in France, on the French-German border. And I was invited back one year for Pesach to Strasbourg, and I fell in love with the city because I had studied French, but as a second language, because of my knowledge of of Yiddish, I wanted to understand what Yiddish, the structure of Yiddish. I took German school. In English, you say I read German. So Strasbourg was the perfect place for me because you had this admixture of German and French culture on the one hand, and it also had a wonderful reputation as being a university of Oriental studies. I say Orientalistik, which was the German word. And I had a Jews college. I believe I had already heard about the brilliance of the school in Strasbourg, which in the German period was mastered by a man called Theodor Nöldeke, who wasn't Jewish, but for the most part his students were rabbis who had to take on doctor. They had to come to the university to earn a university degree. So he prided himself as being as Rabbi Akiva in days of yore, that all his students were rabbis. In fact, when the First World War broke out and Strasbourg returned to France, it had been occupied by the Germans from 1870, he had to flee because of his association with the German administration. Anyway, that's another story. So I decided that Arabic was what I wanted to do. I wanted to read Oriental studies. Strasbourg was the place, and I wrote to Jews College and told them, sadly, I would not be returning to to pursue my rabbinical studies. So I'd specialized in Arabic and Hebrew at Strasbourg University. I also learned Persian, and I went on to do a doctorate. Then I turned to Paris, the Sorbonne, where I studied with Professor Georges Weida, who was probably the top specialist in the area known as Judeo-Arabic. That is, in the High Middle Ages, the Jews wrote many of the classics of our tradition, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, but in Arabic. Yehuda Halevi, the Kuzari, Bach Yad Bakuda, the Duties of the Heart, Sadiq Gaon, Sefer HaEmunot, Kitab al-Amanat, and Maimonides, all wrote their philosophical works, theological works, not in Hebrew, but in Arabic. So this field of study, which is very vast and had taken on a supplementary dimension with the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, which contains a multitude of material in Judeo-Arabic. This was a field called the Judeo-Arabic Studies, of which Professor Weida was one of the leading lights, and so I studied with him and wrote my doctorate on a Judeo-Arabic work called The Garden of the Metaphor, Hadiqa, Kitab al-Hadiqa fil Majaz wal Haqiqa, which was written by Moshe ibn Ezra, one of the great poets of the Spanish Golden Age. And after I'd finished my doctorate, the French government gave me a stipendium, a grant, to perfect myself in Arabic in Beirut. And my wife and I, we were married. My wife, I met at Bnei Akiva, was an undergraduate. We married, and by the time I had my doctorate, we had a little girl, and the three of us spent 1.5 years in Beirut. I studied at the St. Joseph University, which was a Jesuit university, and I had one of the greatest teachers of Lebanese academia, Ephraim Bustani, who was a world-renowned expert in Arabic literature and poetry. I studied with him, and I studied Middle Eastern dialect. To this day, I speak to all the Arabs in Jerusalem in the Eastern dialect. And when we came back to France at the end, because the Civil War broke out. We're in 1975. The Civil War broke out in the Lebanon. That was absolutely disastrous and a very traumatic experience for us. We had to leave Beirut under the shells, and at one particular point, I thought that I would be shot. That I was on the point of being shot, and I escaped. But that's another story.
Can I ask, Paul, when you were in Beirut,
yes,
did you associate yourself with the Jewish community? There's a synagogue, and
I've just written an article on this. There's a book coming out on the Jewish community of the Lebanon, and the editor, Yaron Harel, knew that I had spent some time in Beirut, and he asked me for an article after having ascertained that I had indeed had a connection with the Jewish community. I called my article 5 to Midnight, the end of the Jewish community in Wadi Abu Jamil. This was like the East End. This was the quarter of Lebanon, Beirut, where the Jews lived. And I lived out the last of this community because on account of the Civil War, they all left, or they were forced to leave. And there were unfortunately a number of very tragic incidents that took place. Kidnaps, Jews were kidnapped by the Muslims and later by the Hezbollah, and so they left massively. So I was a witness of the Jewish community in Beirut on its last legs, and I took pictures, and these will soon be published, and I think it's before the end of the year the book will come out. And this is my story as a student in Beirut.
Can I just ask, because it's fascinating, what are your recollections of going to the synagogue, or were there rabbis in the synagogue? Someone I later met up with a Lebanese Jew in Strasbourg, and he told me that Strasbourg and Beirut have a common denominator. Because the population was mixed in Beirut, Muslims and Christians, and because in Alsace you had villages where you had Catholic villages or Protestant villages, or you had villages which were half and half. In those villages where you had Protestants and Catholics, the Jews were the better off, because the Protestants and Catholics were so busy trying to cry each other out and to decry the other, so they had no time for the Jews to bother with the Jews. But in the Catholic villages, the otherness was encapsulated by the Jew. So it's the same thing in Beirut, that the Muslims and Christians hated each other so much. Well, the Civil War was there to demonstrate that they left the Jews on their own. And the story is that we were welcomed by a Jewish family called Meknuz. Mr. Meknuz, Ibrahim Meknuz, a wonderful man,
And he was very Lebanese. In the end, he too left Beirut and settled in Italy. And he told us a story that he used to travel to what is this? Jubail, I think the city was Jubail, where there was a safety match factory, which had been founded by the brother of none other than the first president of Israel. What's his name? The
Weizmann.
Yes.
Chaim Weizmann.
Weizmann. His brother, also I think he must have been delving in chemistry and phosphate, and he built factories, match factories in Palestine at that time and also in the Lebanon. You could travel from Haifa to Beirut by taxi at that time. So the Lebanon wasn't, the country that it became, an alien and enemy country. And he used to travel. He was an accountant in this. So when the Civil War broke out, his car was stopped. He used to travel by car. And the man demanded to travel with him back to Beirut, to take him. He was armed. So he said to him, Shu Ism al-Karim, what's your name? So he said, Brahim. So Brahim can be Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. So this guy was a Muslim. He said, Brahim Shu, what's your family name? So he said, Maknouz. Maknouz is also an Arabic name. It could be Christian, it's nondescript. Christian, Arabic, or whatever. So he said, Shu hadartak, what confession on you? So I said, Yehudi. He wasn't shy to say he was Jewish. So the man, he embraced him. He said, these Christians, look at all the trouble they're making for us. He was like a light of fraternity in the middle of the cesspool of the Civil War. So that was the atmosphere in Beirut. We were able to go to the synagogue and we were unmolested.
And did they have a good minyan? Were there quite a few people?
Oh, the synagogue was still full. There were, I think, something like 13 different, we would call them shtibelach, midrashim they were called, and they took turns of having a minyan, and on Shabbat they would all gather in the main synagogue, Beit Avraham, Magen Avraham synagogue, which had been built by the Sassoon family from Bombay or Calcutta. You've heard of the Sassoons. They had built this synagogue, and the synagogue was full at the time. There was even a wedding there once when we were there, and I took a picture of it. Perhaps this picture will be published with my article. So
how many Jews were living in Beirut at that time?
I think at the heyday there was something like 10,000. But at our time, of course, it's difficult to evaluate. I think there was something like 500 Jews that were still there, maybe more. Jews were clandestinely coming in from Syria, and there was even a few Ashkenazim amongst the Beiruti Jews. I have in mind Mr. Lehrman, whose father or grandfather had been a Slonim, a Chassid from Slonim, from Tiberias, who had come to Beirut as a shochet, and he had settled there, and he bought a building. He bought an apartment building which was marked off to be knocked down to make way for a highway, and he was hoping that he would, he'd stay down in Beirut, that one day he would become rich. I don't know what happened, because we had to leave under the bombs, as I said, but it was still let's say a very discreet community. No show. You would not wear a kippah in the street, but there was still a kosher butcher there, and all of the community departments still functioned. But it all packed in 1975. That was the end, and only a handful of Jews remained. I define them as being those who had nothing and they couldn't leave, and those that had too much to leave behind, so that they didn't leave. These are always the last community members. And then, as I say, there were kidnappings afterwards, and that was the end of a very long history. I must say that while we were in Beirut, we were able, once you're in the Middle East, we were able to have a visa for Syria. We visited Syria, and in Damascus we were able to meet Jews, not on purpose, but by accident we met Jews, and we were able to communicate with them. And afterwards I wrote some articles in the press about the situation of Jews in Syria, and we even traveled over the desert and made our way to Baghdad. There we didn't meet any Jews, but there's a story that I was at that time interested in Islamic mysticism from the time of my BA. That's known as Sufism. Perhaps we'll have time to come back to that. That then became my specialty. And in Baghdad, there is a tomb of a very famous Sufi master called Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani. And the Jews, this I learned later, I was not aware of it at the time, the Jews said Al-Tikra Jilani from Julan, like the man who's head of Syria, president of Syria now, but Tikrat Galili, that he was Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. And so they used to come to him in secret and pray in his tomb. So we were pally with a Kurdish journalist whom we met in Baghdad, and he accompanied us to the shrine of Abd al-Qadir Jilani, and in the courtyard there were hundreds of dervishes, perhaps from India or Afghanistan, and they were swaying in prayer. And so we thought, we'd be able to enter the shrine incognito without being noticed. But as we came to the entrance, one of the worshippers sprang up and put his hands out and stopped us from going in. So the Kurdish man said to him, "Al-Suwah, these are tourists. They've come to honor the master." And said, "Ana mush Suwah Masihiyin. They're not worshippers, they're Christians." As we said, that's the Goyim. So I said, "Today you'll bring," said, "No, let them in." Said, No. Today you will bring us Christians, tomorrow you will bring us Jews. That's one of my favorite anecdotes. So
can I ask, when you were in Baghdad,
yeah,
and also when you were in Syria, did you go to any of the shuls?
No, that was too dangerous. That was much too dangerous. Yeah, they were supervised by the secret police, and we only, by accident, we had 2 contacts with Jews, and we were instrumental. One of the Jews who heard us speaking French, and he had studied in the Alliance schools, there's the French-speaking Jewish schools, and he came up to us spontaneously and asked us if we needed any help. And then we started speaking, and then this and that, and he says, "I'm Jewish and we suffer in Syria." And I said, and I said, did you go to yeshiva? Did you learn shechita? And then he understood that we were also Jewish. And he said, I understand who you are. I have something very important to tell you, but we can't speak here. We are being watched and it's dangerous for me. So we wrote down the name of our hotel, and he was to pass by the hotel at such and such a time. We'd meet him, and we did. We met up that evening, and he told us that his cousins had been disguised. They were girls. They had been disguised as Muslim women because they were completely draped with the niqab and everything. And while crossing into Turkey to escape Syria, they were arrested, and they had been thrown into prison. And could we do anything for them? So we took down their names. I think I might have written it in Hebrew or whatever, in code. And a few days later, we left Syria. This was the end of our term there. And then from Beirut, we wrote to people in France. At that time, there was a Frenchman, Gaston Defer, who was very involved in the liberation of Syrian Jewry, and he brought up their plight before the French government, and they were instrumental in freeing these girls from prison. So that was...
So you had a big part to play in...
Pidyon Asirim. So,
do you know whatever happened to him? Did he manage to be...
Yeah, many, we left... Oh, he wrote to us one day. We got a postcard from Beirut, and he told us he was able to get across. He to cross the border, very dangerous, and he was in Beirut, and we knew that we were, as I say, we knew that there were Jews coming from Syria. They were paid very heavily to bring them out. They were kept in Beirut, and then there was a secret bus that took them to the border at Ras al-Naqora, Rosh Hanikra, and they crossed the border. There was some, it was heavily paid for, but this was a passage which was known. So he used that, and he came to Israel. And then we met him in Israel when we came to visit a few years afterwards, and then we were out of touch. And many, many years later, I gave a lecture in Bar Ilan University, and he saw my name, and he came to the lecture, and we met again. We embraced after 20 years, and we met also his cousins, whom we had saved, that they were also in Israel, and they were school teachers or something. So I did my doctorate at the Sorbonne with Professor Vaida. Then I applied for an advertisement which had appeared in the Jewish Chronicle to be a research assistant at Cambridge University, and I was accepted, and for 5 years I had the privilege of working on the Cairo Geniza material, and I gathered lots of material for myself, for my studies, for my research, and since then until now I've been publishing material that I had discovered then or later, and I pride myself as being one of the senior researchers in the field of Geniza studies, Judeo-Arabic studies, in which my field of specialization was the relationship between Jewish mysticism and Muslim mysticism. That's not Kabbalah, not necessarily Kabbalah. There's a sort of philosophical mysticism which is coming out of the school of Maimonides in the 13th, 14th century, which lasted for many generations. And there are a number of works which were written in the spirit of Sufi theology and mysticism, which had influenced Judaism at this time. And that I published. That's the area in which I published for many decades. This is the field in which my work is better known. So I'm sure listeners will be interested in hearing a little about the treasures of the Cairo Geniza. I was accepted as a research assistant at the research unit of the Taylor Schechter research unit, which was situated in the Cambridge University Library, one of the biggest libraries of the Western Hemisphere. And the director at that time was Stefan Breif, Dr. Stefan Breif, and he saw that I had a doctorate from the Sorbonne, from Professor Vaida, and that I was a specialist in Judeo-Arabic, so I was immediately snapped up. And my job consisted in let's say, identifying and classifying documents from the Cairo Geniza in Judeo-Arabic. So Stefan Breif was in contact with what we call one of the greatest Genizologists of all times, Dr. Professor Goitein, Shlomo Dov Goitein, who was living at that time in Princeton, but was a frequent visitor to Cambridge. He had surveyed the whole of the Geniza, which contains hundreds of thousands of fragments and manuscripts. And he was mostly interested in the documentary material, letters, business letters, private correspondence, which reflected the daily life of the Jews in a Middle Eastern country, Egypt, not only Egypt. He became interested in Cairo Geniza because he was writing about the India trade. This was his focus before he became a Genizologist. And he discovered in the Geniza documents letters from merchants on the Silk Way to India, and that's how he became a Genizologist. But he was primarily interested in the documentary period, the history of the correspondence, the personalities, and in particular I was attracted to his portrait of Rabbi Avraham Maimonides, who was the son of Maimonides, who had left lots of material in the Cairo Geniza, which at one time been the depository of what it seems the rabbinical archives of Cairo, including the writings, the autograph writings of Maimonides, the autograph writings of Rabbi Avraham Maimonides, and the descendants of Maimonides to the 6th generation, Rabbi David II ben Yehoshua Maimonides, who lived part of his life in Egypt, of course, and then removed to Syria. So these became my daily companions. You know, I was reading Maimonides in his actual handwriting for 5 years. An anecdote is that during that time, a delegation from the Bank of Israel came, and they were planning on making a banknote because there was a lot of inflation. This is a joke. There was a lot of inflation at the time, and they wanted to give some ponderance, some weight to the shekel, because one of the photographers spoke Yiddish. It said, "The shekel schockelt sich." The shekel is wavering, so they wanted to give it some weight, and they wanted the signature of Maimonides on the 1,000 shekel note, which eventually became the 1 new shekel. That's the same banknote. And they actually took a picture of Maimonides' signature to put on the banknote. They didn't copy a copy, they wanted the original. So that was one of the multiple anecdotes I could relate about my time at the Cairo Geniza. But Abraham Maimonides, benefiting from the erudition and the leadership which his father personified, also became head of Egyptian Jewry, as his which he inherited from his father. And since Cairo was the center of gravity of the Jewish world between Spain in the west and Persia and Iraq in the east, everything passed through Cairo. It was a crossroads. So there's so much in the Cairo Geniza in terms of Jewish material, biblical material, Talmudic material, Midrashic material, but also sundry items like book lists and laundry lists and grocery lists, you name it, it was there. They said that the last document that was deposited in the Cairo Geniza was Schechter's bus ticket from Cairo to Fustat, where the Cairo Knesset was situated, before he packed it into tea chests and sent it off to Liverpool and eventually to Cambridge in England. So I specialized in Rabbi Avraham Maimonides' writings, and the fact that he had been, contrary to his father, who was a strict philosopher, he was a mystical philosopher and was very open, imbibed with the spirit of Sufism, which took off in his time in a very powerful way in Egypt. And he was a witness to the flowering of Sufism in Egypt, and he incorporated into his works, inasmuch as he claimed that the Sufis, he says, be not surprised about my admiration for the Sufis, because the mystics of Islam, because the truth is they are following in the steps of the Prophet of Israel, and not the other way round. That if I admire them, I imitate them, it's not because I'm imitating them, but I'm imitating what they are imitating, i.e., they inherited all this from the Jews, and in particular the prophets of Israel. And there is some truth in that, because Moses plays a very prominent part in Sufism, as do other Jewish biblical prophets. So I then became interested in the relationship between Jewish mysticism and Muslim mysticism, and I used my time at Cambridge to survey the collection and prospect those documents, those fragments that were connected with Sufism, which were easy, what someone who had a practice of eye, someone who was perceptive, were easy to locate because of the language they use. They use, like in Kabbalistic vocabulary, they have a special vocabulary. So as soon as you found a fragment, a biblical commentary, or a commentary on prayer, or a commentary on Midrash, that uses this terminology, it was clear that they belonged to this movement of, I call them Judeo-Sufis. So this became my main concern, and I've worked on this for many decades, publishing texts which I found in the Geniza and also in university collections, both in what was the USSR. I traveled in before the fall of communism. I traveled to the Soviet Union, and I was one of the first Western scholars to have been admitted into the Cairo Geniza. Their collection in what was then Leningrad, later St. Petersburg. There also I had relations with the Jewish community, which were facilitated by the fact I could speak Yiddish. I could communicate to them in Yiddish. You know, I couldn't speak Russian. I had very little Russian, and people didn't want to speak in Hebrew or English. But as soon as I spoke in Yiddish, they opened their hearts. It was like, the communication immediately passed. So that was also a very enriching experience. And
this is the time with the refuseniks.
The time of the refuseniks. And it was dangerous, not only for myself, but also for them, to have any relationship. And not time now, but there was some very close encounters, and people who would meet me on the corner of, and although they had been sitting by me on the underground, the Metropolitan, they didn't speak to me. It was only once we were out of earshot that we were able to discuss. Okay, that's another chapter. So eventually,
how long were you in Russia?
I was there on one occasion. The longest time I was there was for 1 month, and after that, the regime collapsed, and I was able to come freely. I think I was there on 3 other occasions. I even taught at the St. Petersburg University, and in the framework for the Hebrew University, set up a class in St. Petersburg, and I taught there in Hebrew. I gave by that time the Jewish schools had been established, and these were the first students that had learned Hebrew and were fluent in Hebrew, and I taught them in Hebrew.
And Paul, can I ask, did you go to the Hermitage?
I went to the Hermitage, of course.
And did you see the Jewish collection?
No, the Jewish collection, I'm not sure if you're talking about Judaica. At that time, it was still the Soviet Union, and there was no exhibition of anything Jewish, except in one museum, which no longer exists, which was called the Museum of Atheism, which the object of which was to disparage any religious belief, be it Orthodox or Muslim or Jewish. So there were lots of Jewish artifacts which were presented in a negative light as being superstitious and parochial, closed-mindedness. So I did have a connection with the Jewish community, and mostly in Yiddish. And what's more, I met a man who came from Shchedrin, from my great-grandfather's shtetl. And he said, and I asked him, he was in his 90s. I asked him whether he recalled any member of my family. And he told me, he was a young boy, and in order to recollect to bring back recollections of that time, he'd have to reconstruct 80 years of history. But I must tell you this, I was there for Pesach, and they asked me to daven Musaf for Tfilat Tal. And there were only old people at the synagogue. The youngsters were too frightened. As soon as they identified with Judaism, they lost their jobs. They were marginalized. So there were only old people, and they were sitting along the sides of the synagogue. And I began to sing, and they came closer and closer and closer. And at one point, I felt their nearness. So I turned right, and I saw a group of old men huddling together to listen to me, and they were crying.
It's incredible. It's so moving. It's so
so moving. They were moved to see how old I was like in my late 20s, to see a young man singing the Jewish liturgy that they had heard 70 years ago. That was very moving. Okay, so we must come to an end.
No, but you have the pictures from the Cairo, the original Cairo Geniza.
This is 100 years after the discovery of this 1988, I think. Celebrate 100 years after the discovery of the Cairo Geniza. By that time, Israel and Egypt had signed a peace treaty, and the embassy was allowed to set up a Israeli cultural center, and this was organized by the Israeli Cultural Center. Here, let me take this again. Here we have the Israeli ambassador for cultural affairs at that time. I'm sorry, his name escapes me, a very dear friend. This was an Egyptian scholar who would come with, and this is me in the middle, and this is the Cairo Geniza above us. This is where people for hundreds of years have thrown scraps of paper and what we call in Yiddish shemus into the Geniza for hundreds of years. So,
can I ask, did you spend a bit of time in Cairo, in Egypt?
I've been to Cairo on several occasions. As a French citizen, I became French citizen. I was allowed to the use of the what was called the French Archaeological Center in Cairo. I was guest there on at least 2 occasions, and at that time I carried out research in the National Library, Egyptian National Library, on manuscripts as part of my research. And I was also very interested in seeping in the atmosphere of Cairo, the dialect, the mentality, and they are in Arabic say tayyibin, which means tovim, in the same word in Arabic and Hebrew, tayyibin. Once you get to know them, you can sit down in a cafe and they tell you the stories. They're easygoing people, not fierce like these people from Gaza.
And Paul, can I ask, when you were in Cairo, did you ever go downtown Cairo to the synagogue?
Of course. I visited it was empty. There was no service there. There were next to no Jews at all, except at one time I visited an old age home, which was still run by the skeleton of Jewish officials. And I met a lady, and she said that her parents had come to Egypt from Palestine in the First World War, but that her father had property, and I think even landed property in Palestine, become Israel, and she wanted me to go with her to a lawyer, and she would give me the what's it called, the
deed, or the deeds,
the delegation, to be her representative, to help her, because she was penniless, and she was in a charitable organization. She wanted to live as she had done with her parents, with dignity, and she wanted me, but I was there for so short a time, it was impossible.
And did you?
I often think of what I could have done.
Did you go to the Karaite? They have
yes,
Karaite?
I visited the Karaite community, and I wanted to see the Karaite Bible, which is one of the most famous Jewish Hebrew codexes in the world, but they wouldn't allow me. It was in a safe, and I have the feeling that it already had disappeared, that it had been smuggled out of the country, because they were so reluctant to show me. But whereas the man was otherwise quite pleasant, and we spoke about Karaism, so I met the last Karaite Jews in Egypt. And then
did you manage to go to Alexandria as well?
Alexandria, yes. I visited the Nabi Daniel synagogue, which is very impressive,
and
monumental
you saw
building.
when they opened their own Kodesh, there's so many Sifrei Torah.
Oh yeah, I was there, and I think I spent a week in Alexandria, and I also met a scholar, an Egyptian scholar who was working on Sufism. I went to his house, and he welcomed me, and he told me that he had been on the Suez Canal during the '67 war, and that they were shooting down Israeli planes, and that they ran out of ammunition, and the Israeli plane dived as if to bomb them, and when he was low enough, he saluted them, and he flew off. And he said, from that moment forth I understood that the Israelis are not animals, they are human beings with human feelings. It was a wonderful experience.
And Paul, can I just ask you, because when I was there, I met 2 Egyptians that were fluent in Hebrew.
Yeah. So, if you study, like myself, if you studied Hebrew at a European type university, you were obliged to study a second Oriental language. So the same thing in the university system in Egypt, which was probably introduced by the French or the British rather. So you studied, if you wanted to study Arabic literature, you had to take a second subject. So the easiest thing for them was Hebrew, because there's so much in common between Arabic and Hebrew. So they studied, many students who studied Arabic as a major. As a minor, they studied Hebrew, because otherwise the alternative was Syriac or Persian, which was boring, they told me. Whereas in Hebrew you could read Ephraim Kishon, and you could read humorous and novels, which is much more exciting. So many of them took up Hebrew, and they found jobs, both in the military, of course, but also as guides.
They took me to the Karaite synagogue. They took me to the Karaite synagogue.
So
and we got on very well.
That's where it's coming from. And they have a facility. Arabs have a facility for learning Hebrew, and this is one of my messages, that I deeply regret that there are so few Israelis that are fluent in Arabic. There are so many Arabs. I'm sure that they highly outnumber Jews who knows Arabic, Arabs that know Hebrew. Not only those in Israel, Israeli Arabs, but also in Egypt, in Morocco. In Morocco, there are Arabs who know Hebrew. So, to cut a long story short, after my doctorate, I taught Arabic in secondary school. Just as in England, you could have as an option Russian or Spanish. So in France, it was introduced that Arabic could be an option for the Muslim population, and they made no mystery about the fact that they thought that if the Arab Muslim children learned Arabic, they would go back to Algeria. No such thing. But they were promoting Arabic studies, and I was on the crest of the waves. And then there was an opening at university. I was first at Lyon University, then at Strasbourg University as a professor. This is my old alma mater. So there was a great pride that I occupied the chair of my former Professor André Neher, who was a great light in the post-war period. And then eventually I was appointed to the Sorbonne, where I spent the last 20 years of my career in the Arabic and Hebrew department. It was initially the Arabic department, but I insisted that Hebrew had been taught at the Sorbonne in the Middle Ages and had been interrupted at the time of the Revolution, and we had to reinstall Hebrew in the program of the Sorbonne, and people were very sensitive to my appeal, and they created the Hebrew and Arabic department at the Sorbonne, which is unique in maybe in the whole of Europe. There's no department that is called the Hebrew and Arabic department. So I was there, and I continued my research into Judeo-Sufism. I published a work by David the second Maimonides, which is entirely impregnated with Sufi technical terms and vocabulary and theology. And of late, I realized that if I wanted to embrace the whole of the field of the influence of Sufism, i.e. Islamic mysticism, Judaism, I had to take into account also Persian studies, the Persianate realm, be it today Uzbekistan, Iran, Afghanistan, all these countries that spoke Persian, and who were great lovers of poetry. You can find even today hundreds of Persian Jews who may be little educated in Jewish matters, but can recite realms and realms of Persian poetry, bearing in mind that poetry is something like 70% Sufi. It's mystical poetry. So they were very imbibed with Sufism. So I knew that if I had to study the influence of Sufism on Judaism, I would have to take into account the Persian regions. So I went back to Persian, brushed up my Persian, and I started wading through the Judeo-Persian manuscripts in the Hebrew University. What is Judeo-Persian? It's Persian written in Hebrew characters for the use of Jews. And there I started to, first of all, to catalog all the manuscripts that had a Sufi content. And then all of a sudden I came upon a manuscript which had not been fully described, and I began to read it in Persian, and I realized that the author, who was obviously Jewish, and he was the actual author of the book, he wasn't a copyist, it wasn't a work by Rumi of the Whirling Dervishes that had been copied into Hebrew characters. That also exists. But this was his genuine own work. I realized that I felt that he was an extraordinary poet. So I have an Iranian friend here who is one of these Iranian Jews who is a great lover of poetry, and I started reading to him this, by the way, is Shaheen. This is a versified version of the Chumash in Judeo-Persian. It's written in Persian verses, Persian poetry, but in Hebrew characters. And Shaheen is considered the greatest. He lived in the 15th century, I believe, and he is considered as the greatest Persian Jewish poet of all times. And this man, he was listening to my recital of this poetry, and he said, "But this is wonderful. He said, this man, his name is Sabzavari. Sabzavari is here, and Shaheen is here." And we ended up calling him the Jewish Hafiz. Hafiz is the greatest name in Persian poetry. There's not a Persian who hasn't got a book, hasn't got in his home the Quran and Hafiz. So we called him the Jewish Hafiz, and for the last 2 years we have been transliterating the Persian back into Arabic characters and translating into English. And this is my next book.
And how old is the book?
This book here is 100 years old. It was printed in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem?
Yeah, look at the title page. Shaheen Torah, Yerushalayim, and it was published by a Bukharan Jew called Shimon Chacham, who was a very great scholar, and he found the manuscripts of this work, which ended up in Russia. They found their way to St. Petersburg Library, the same manuscript he worked on, and he published this. And at one time, the Jews who were fluent in Persian literature, they would read this like Echad Mikra Shnaim Targum. They would read the Chumash, and they would read Shaheen's poetic translation.
That's amazing.
So, we are hopeful after the stirring events of the past months that this tyrannical regime, I call it mularchy, the mularchy is on its last leg, and it will fall within our lifetime in the near future. And Sabzavari, this poet, Darvishi Sabzavari, poet from the 16th century, 500 years ago, was writing such a beautiful poetry, but both in a Sufi light. Many of my listeners may be familiar with the name Al-Hallaj. Hallaj died in 990, put to death by mullahs in Baghdad for his indiscreet, imprudent divulging of the secrets of mysticism. He was put to death, but he's mentioned by Sabzavari. Sabzavari that's his hero. He's a Muslim, but this Jewish poet adores Al-Hallaj, mentions him in his poetry. We are hopeful that Sabzavdarvish Sabzavari, who is so steeped in his love, in Persian poetry, and his love of Persia, he can serve as a bridge between the Jewish people and the Iranian people, as to show that at one time there was entente, there was harmony and fraternity between our two peoples. This is the light of hope, and culture, literature, philately can all be contacts, can all be how do you say? It can all be instrumental in bringing people together and in overcoming our differences, and on the contrary, showing that we have much more in common than that which separates us.
Oh, it's such a beautiful message. And I just want to ask you, Prof, as a visiting professor, you've been to many universities like Oxford.
I've been to Oxford, I've been to the States, I've been to the Cape Town University, I lectured there. Stellenbosch University, I lectured at Stellenbosch University, and I gave a class in biblical Hebrew to Protestant students that were coming from African countries to Stellenbosch to study. I've been to Australia. Okay, so the amongst the many venues to which I've been invited, including Lausanne in Switzerland, Helsinki. I think one of the places that is high up on my list as having been a great privilege is Damascus. Under the Assad regime, through the auspices of the French Cultural Center in Damascus, I was invited a number of years ago to Damascus, and I spoke in Arabic in front of an audience of academics, mostly, 99% of whom were Syrian students, and I spoke about the relationship, my speciality, the relationship between Jewish mysticism and Muslim mysticism. And amongst other things, I was able to visit the Assad Library, the university library in Damascus, and I subsequently wrote about my impressions of the intellectual atmosphere, or rather the lack of an intellectual atmosphere in Syria at the time.
And how were you received being Jewish?
I think most of my listeners realize that I was Jewish, even though, as Paul Fenton, that was not obvious. And there was, outside of the lecture room, I did not, of course, broadcast that I was Jewish in any way, with one exception, which I will relate in a few minutes. But there was one incident that was rather distasteful, that probably the regime had sent an agent to listen to my lecture to ensure that it was 100% halal, kosher, and of course he had to intervene, and he said, "How can you speak of that the Jews have divine love when they are massacring Arab children?" You know, the same cliche. I said, I'm sorry, this has nothing to do with my lecture. I'm talking about Jewish mysticism 9 centuries ago, not in the contemporary period, so I brushed him aside. But I had been invited by the director of the French Cultural Center who works on Sufism, and myself, and he had promised me two things. One, that we would go to the tomb of Ibn Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, who was the greatest mystic in the Muslim tradition, and is buried in Damascus. He actually came from Murcia in Spain and followed the immigration of the Sufis who were thrown out of Al-Andalus because of the clerical intolerance, Muslim intolerance. So he's buried in Damascus, and we were also to visit the synagogue. There's a very old synagogue in one of the suburbs of Damascus, and we were supposed to visit it, and before we were able to do so, he asked the ambassador in France, the French ambassador, to give his okay, and he said, no, this man has been invited by the French Cultural Service, and we don't want any ripples, and so we weren't allowed to go. But I was walking in the old Jewish quarter of Damascus one evening, and a door opened, and a man came out, and he was speaking in French. So I said, I knew what was inside. I knew that this was the Farhi, a man called, is it Abraham Farhi, who was the Minister of Finance of the Pasha of Damascus, and later on of Ahmed Jazzar, the Pasha of Acre, and he was a brilliant man, also Rabbi Talmid Chacham, and he was tortured by his former master and eventually put to death. And this was his residence in Damascus. I knew it was. And I asked the man coming out in French, I was interested in history, could he say something about the building? He said he was an architect, he studied architecture in France, this was his wife, and that he had been approached by he was Syrian government to restore this building, which is beautiful inside, and which would then become a luxury hotel. So I said, oh, well, can I visit? And he said, inside there was a watchman. So he said, oh, we'll ask the watchman to show you around because I must go. So he left, and I was thankful. So I had all the time I wanted to visit the Farhi residence, which was a palace, literally a palace, and all covered in Hebrew inscriptions. And at one point it looked over the synagogue. So I saw the synagogue from above, like Moshe in last week's Seder. He saw the Holy Land from afar, but there he could not set his foot. So I saw the synagogue from outside, and the amazing thing was, he was saying that you'd met Egyptians who read Hebrew. The Syrian watchman, he had learnt Hebrew. He had learnt Arabic at university and studied Hebrew, and he could decipher the Hebrew inscriptions which coming from the Psalms around the ceiling of the Farhi mansion. Isn't that amazing?
It's incredible.
Yeah. This is like being let into Ali Baba's cave.
Wow, that must have been the most amazing scene to see. Hebrew inscriptions in Damascus.
Yeah, when I came back, I was like walking on air.
So Paul, this was 2013.
2013, but I might like to add that this is the very first time I've ever revealed that I was in Damascus at that time. It could have been misunderstood, even by my closest friends, who were very surprised that in the first time in many, many years I shaved off my beard. And but they never asked any questions. But anyway, it's the first time I've ever revealed to anybody that I was there. Now that the regime is a thing of the past, I don't think that can jeopardize in any way my chances of ever returning to Damascus.
Please God, one day we'll be able to return.
Yeah, we'll be able to.
And you coming to Israel, was it always a dream to come live in Israel?
As soon as I retired, all my children, I have 6 children, 5 of whom are in Israel, are Israeli citizens, and I brought them up as Zionists. As you heard earlier on, I was an active member of Bnei Akiva, and it was always been my dream to come on Aliyah. I'm a staunch Zionist, and as soon as I retired, I came on Aliyah with my wife to Israel, to be with my children and grandchildren.
That's wonderful.
And to be in the eye of history, where history is unfolding, Jewish history is unfolding.
And Paul, what's going on now? Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Do you see, what is your message for what we're going through? Knowing...
I think that what I can't understand, I can understand many things. What I can't understand is that the Jewish people generally, and a large part of Israeli population, after having gone through all we have experienced in these last terrible, tragic, stirring months, they cannot see that history is unfolding between our eyes, and that what we have lived through miracles and marvels, and people just going on with their day-to-day life and not preparing themselves for what I think will be a wonderful future for Israel and Jewish people.
Paul, thank you so much.
So, in the framework of my invitations to foreign overseas universities, I think it's interesting to mention that I was invited by a research student at the University of Lublin in eastern Poland to come to the Catholic University of Lublin to give a week seminar on Maimonides and the importance of Maimonides in Jewish thought, which we did. And first of all, this was also the opportunity for us, my first visit to Poland, and we were able to, of course, make a pilgrimage to Auschwitz and to many cities of which had in the past been of great importance, as we say in Hebrew, Ir ve'em b'Yisrael, which had been centers of Jewish scholarship and piety. And on one occasion, one of the students who spoke French proposed to be our interpreter, and he was from the town of Lizhensk. And I said, we must visit Lizhensk. And he said, but why? The Jews never ever lived in Lizhensk. I said, but no, they did. And not only did they, Lizhensk was a center of gravity of Hasidism, of Jewish pietism, and is home to the tomb of one of the greatest figures of early Hasidism, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk, author of the Noam Elimelech, which is a book I read with great interest because I find that there are common denominators between what Rabbi Elimelech has to say about the tzaddik and what the Sufis say about their sheikhs. But anyway, he said, I can assure you, my parents were born in Lizhensk, I've lived there, he was about 30 years old, that the Jews never ever lived there. So, so we traveled by taxi to Lizhensk, or perhaps he took us in his car, I can't remember, but anyway, he was with us, and we stopped at the Jewish cemetery. That was the first discovery that he made, the first amazement that in his own hometown there was a Jewish cemetery. And there was an old woman coming out, and I said, can you ask her who has the key of the cemetery? And she said to us in Yiddish, don't ask him, I can tell you where. I have the key. And she ran home, brought us the key, and led us into the cemetery. And I said, but she spoke even better Yiddish than myself, saftige Yiddish, as a really colorful Yiddish. I said, but I'm not Jewish. She said, but I was a Shabbos goy. I worked with the Jewish families, and I brought their children up, and I looked and I did their cooking, etc. And this was my second language, Yiddish. That's one anecdote. And he was so amazed that we belied what he had said, that he thought that never Jews, and he was someone who was a Polish woman, a Catholic Polish woman speaking Yiddish, which is the ultimate proof that Jews had lived in Niziansk. And as I came towards the end of the seminary, the students were so appreciative of what I had said, was translated from French into Polish, that they brought me little presents, and one by one they left. And then there was a last group there of about 3 or 4 students holding flowers. And when all the others have left, they approached us, my wife was with me, and they gave us the flowers, and they expressed something in Polish I didn't quite understand, but I gathered there was some token of their appreciation. And then I asked the interpreter, what was so special about those who remained until the end? What message did they want to convey? And she said, and this was extraordinary. She said, "They're like me." What do you mean? We are studying in a Catholic university. We are Catholics, but in reality we are Jews. Our parents are Jewish. And she told her own personal story that after the war, her parents had left Poland, never to come back, and they had come to Palestine, and they just couldn't get used to the climate. And so, despite everything, they decided that they would have to return to Lublin, and in order to survive, they would have to become Catholics. And this was their daughter. They're one of 2 anecdotes of.
And Prof, there's a third one where you mentioned that you went to Chochmei Lublin, that Meir Shapiro once he built. But you heard something that he once said.
We went to visit. I think it was in the rector. The rector came to pay his homage, and together we went to what used to be the yeshiva of Lublin, and which was now, and I suppose it still is, the Faculty of Medicine. That these amphitheaters
they've converted into part hotel, and they've got a Jewish section where they show the history of the yeshiva.
At the time, this was right at the end. I think the communist regime was still in place, but it was.
I was in 2019.
No, this is 1989. This was.
So today it's a hotel
in Russia, and the fall of communism in I can tell you 2 stories. I must end with two anecdotes. Okay, went in the company of the rector of the Catholic University, and he said to us, sincerely, that we believe that we are the continuators of the yeshiva of Lublin, that we are teaching philosophy. And because I think there wasn't at University of Lublin when the yeshiva existed. It's a provincial city. So that's one anecdote. The second anecdote is that one of my students was a priest. One of the students, and he was eager to learn about Maimonides. And he said, "I would like to invite you to our town, not Mezerich, a name like Mezerich. I can't recall how it was." And he says, "And I will introduce you to the last Jew in Mezerich. But you should know that he is like me, he's a priest." So we decided that we take on the challenge, and we traveled to. It was very interesting because the priest's father had found a Jewish child in a field which had been thrown from a train that was taken, Jews from Lublin, to the gas chamber. And he brought this child up as his own child, this baby girl's own child. That was something very moving. And then we went to see the priest in the church, and he spoke to us in German. He couldn't speak French or English, but he spoke very good German. And as I said, I told you that I studied German. That's my second foreign language. I'm German at school, so we discussed in German. And he was like a diatribe. He was like a speech against the capitalists. And I think he probably meant the Jews, that the capitalists had destroyed the Poland, and then the communists had destroyed Poland, but now Poland will again regain its glory. So I said to my wife, that's I don't think we should stay any longer. So we got up and said, thank you very much. And as we were going to the door, he broke out in Yiddish and said to me, Kit ibra gris alle unsere Chavairim. Said, greet on my part all our friends. And he meant the Jews. Then he was talking against the Jews so that the other priest should hear what he was saying, and there was another woman who was present saying, but when secretly as he took the door, he broke into Yiddish and said, greet the Jewish people for me.
Amazing. But I just have to mention, Paul, you said something about Rameir Shapiro.
Yeah.
When he built Chachmei Lublin.
I think this is one of his authentic sayings, that after spending many years traveling from east to west, I think it even came to the States. He came to Strasbourg. I published an article about his visit to Strasbourg, collecting money to build the yeshiva. And I don't know if it was after the inauguration. There's a famous photograph where he's on the balcony besides the Chotke Rebbe, and they are celebrating the opening of the yeshiva. I'm not sure whether it was shortly after that or later on. He confided in one of his intimate friends that he now had doubts, had he made a mistake, and would he have done better to have built the yeshiva in Eretz Israel.
I think that's the message for our times.
Yeah. I was privileged to have known one or two people who had survived the war and had been graduates of, or had been students at the Lubliner Chachmei Lublin. And I studied in France, in Aix-les-Bains, and the name of the yeshiva was Chachmei Tzorfat, which is very close. And many years later, I was at that time, I was 16 years old. I had no idea of the existence of Chachmei Lublin. But I was later told that Rabbi Leibel, who had established this yeshiva, wanted to call it Chachmei Lublin. He himself was a graduate of Chachmei Lublin. That's why I say I had known a few of the people who were, Talmidei Chachamim, pious people, extraordinary people. And actually, very often I study this work here. Here it's Tzvi, by the Tzvi Fruma. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Chachmei Lublin. He was murdered in the Shoah, but he had come to Palestine, and he said, no, I must go back, the students are calling me. And he was arrested and put to death by the Nazis. But if you read his Divrei Torah, this is Al HaTorah, Al HaMoadim, this is the summit of Polish Jewry. They were creative and scholarly. We will never know the depth of the loss we suffered. in the Shoah, losing people like him and thousands of others. So to get back to Rabbi Leibel, he wanted to call the yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, but the Rabbi Weil, Ernest Weil, who was the second founder of the yeshiva, he came from Alsace, so he wasn't happy that they would call the yeshiva after an institution that came from the Ostjuden. So they disagreed, and finally they came upon the name of Chachmei Tzarfat, half and half. Those were not the sages of Lublin, but the sages of France.
Thank you so much. Wow. Paul, there are no words. There are no words to thank you enough. I am spellbound. Your life is just absolutely incredible, and what you've been through and what you've achieved and what you've seen, and your message is so profound.
Yeah.
That there is hope, that we can get on with each other.
Yeah.
And I think it is just astounding, and I'm so incredibly grateful to you.
Okay, just to end on something which was a common denominator, so to put it, between yourself and myself. I didn't have time to explain that when I was in South Africa, I was supposed to be a lecturer, a visiting scholar at the Stellenbosch University campus, and I ended up being a chazan at the Sea Point Synagogue. And I made the acquaintance of a man, I think his name Joseph Sapira, who at that time was the president of the community, and he told me, when he'd learned that I was an Arabist, he told me that he had a great uncle from Riteve, from where his family had originated, who was also an Arabist and who had ended up as being an Arabic interpreter in the British Army. And I was so fascinated by his story that I did some research. At first I thought it was a legend. So I did research on Getzel Zelikovic, who I eventually discovered and researched, and I brought to light his memoirs, which he had written at the end of his life in the 1920s in a New York daily newspaper, Der Tag, I think it was called. And on a visit to New York, I photocopied them. At the time there was no digitalization. I photocopied them, I transcribed them, translated them into Yiddish, and published the book with lots of notes, because Zelikovic had also had a fantastic life. He was born in Lithuania. He was brought up like myself as a yeshiva bacha. He spoke Yiddish. He came to study Arabic in Paris like myself, and he ended up in Constantinople and as a British officer in the Sudan at the time of the Mahdi uprising, and eventually he emigrated to America, where a fantastic career as a journalist was awaiting him. So when this book came out in Paris, I translated it into French. It came out in Paris. I was interviewed on the French radio, and the speaker finished up by saying, we are now convinced, Professor Fenton, that you are a reincarnation of Getzel Zelikovic.
Really, I just cannot thank you enough.
Okay.
And really, it's been such an honor and a privilege to be here today.
Okay.